2014, Wisconsin exports to the UK increased by nearly 25%, and imports into the state from the UK are up about 16.5%. This is good news for either side of the pond, and we want to build off of it through 2015 and certainly into the future. Aircraft parts and other related items to aircraft are a major engine in that growth, a jet engine, if you will, with a nearly 160% growth in exports. Wisconsin employers like Astronautics Corporation of America, Rexnord, and Plexus are heavily involved in these areas. Other companies from Wisconsin are also involved here in the UK. Places like Joy Global and Aaron's lead the way in industrial machinery. GE Healthcare, a name you might be familiar with, National Electrostatics Corporation, and Standard Imaging in scientific and medical instruments. Johnson Controls, Walkwell Innovation, Miller Electric, and A.O. Smith in electrical machinery. And Case IH Magnum, Oshkosh Corporation, and of course, Harley-Davidson in vehicles and parts. In fact, I get a kick out of this. On Monday when I came in, I stopped by Wars to get a dealership pin because Wars here in London is the oldest continuously owned Harley-Davidson dealership in Europe. So as a Harley rider myself, I had to get a pin, even while here with a good Wisconsin brand. In other words, not just with Harley, but with others, we love doing business in the UK. Now we hope to encourage more British employers and investors to take a closer look at the exciting things happening in my home state of Wisconsin. Over the past 4 years, we've balanced our budgets and lowered our tax burdens on individuals, on employers, and on property. In fact, property taxes are now lower on a typical home than they were in 2010. How many other American governors can say that? For those of you interested in manufacturing, we wipe out nearly all of the taxable liability on production by next tax year. Add in a well-trained workforce, great colleges and universities, excellent apprenticeship and worker training programs, and a world-class supply chain, and you can see why Wisconsin is one of the top states both for manufacturing jobs overall and for the growth in manufacturing jobs in the United States. On top of all that, the Badger State hosts the Global Water Center near the shores of Lake Michigan in Milwaukee, and our state is the home to more than 300 water technology companies. Our state is a leader in powering global industry, in quality healthcare and bioscience, and in the food and beverage industry. Plus, Wisconsin is, and you wouldn't be surprised if you'd be surprised if I didn't say this, Wisconsin is one of the largest cheese makers in the world. That's where we get the cheese head thing from with the backers. That's right, that's right.
It took a bit of
It's
time,
all a matter of
actually.
time. Justin was counting off timing to see when I'd get to that. It's not just for the Green Bay Packers, which we're very fond of, but because of our cheese makers. Now, put this in perspective. If my state was a country, it would rank 4th in the world for cheese production, behind the United States, France, and Germany, and just above Italy. One state alone. In fact, Wisconsin received nearly 40% of the awards at the 2014 World Championship Cheese Contest. Our cheesemakers swept 11 of the 90 classes, taking the top 3 prizes in each class. We want to compete anywhere in the world. That is why we're open to free trade. As I've said to the ambassador many times before, our hope is that there will not be restrictions on geographical indications within the final version of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. You see, Colby cheese comes from Colby, Wisconsin. We believe we make it better than anyone in the world, but we do not begrudge anyone else trying to make a better cheese. In other words, we say, let the best cheese win. From my point of view, truly free trade rewards hard work and innovation. We think that is a good thing for the UK and Europe overall, as well as for America. Positive trade relations were a wonderful part of our special bond in the past, and I believe they're an important part of strengthening that bond in the future. Speaking of history, I had the opportunity to speak at the alma mater of former President Ronald Reagan this past Friday. He was a true champion of free enterprise and of free trade. He was also a great believer in the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. During dinner, Tonette and I were seated with his personal assistant for the decade after he served as our nation's president. She showed us the many wonderful pictures of various foreign leaders who came to visit the Reagans over the years after his presidency. None were closer to him than former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Like our countries, they had a special bond. To honor that friendship and to reinforce the special relationship between our countries, I visited Prime Minister Thatcher's burial site on Monday. It was my honor to pay respects to your Iron Lady. On Tuesday, just yesterday, we visited the rooms where former Prime Minister Winston Churchill kept track of the war. It made me think of the strong connection between him and President Roosevelt, and it made me ponder, of course, on Churchill's famous words that we hear often in our state and across our country. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear upon ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Just like two dear friends, and our countries have stood together and fought 2 world wars. Earlier this week, I visited the graves of American and British service members at Brookwood Military Cemetery. The caretakers there shared with me the many stories of courage and valor. They even showed me the tombstones of some of the fallen from Wisconsin. Their sacrifices is what inspires those who venture into harm's way today. I was honored to personally thank some of those current heroes at Headley Court. As you know, these men and women have lost a limb or suffered a serious injury, and yet here they were, working hard to get back at it. It instantly reminded me of the things I see of the wounded warriors I've met over the years at Walter Reed back in the States. God bless them one and all. In closing, I'd like to note that with each of these visits, they reminded me of the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. Initially, that relationship began because of people like Thomas Llewellyn, who came to work in America as a blacksmith and whose great-great-grandson is now the governor of the great state of Wisconsin. That tremendous economic connection between the U.S. and the U.K., as Prime Minister Cameron mentioned last month in D.C. and affirmed again yesterday here in London, that relationship is another reason for, or that connection, I should say, is another reason for our special relationship. Thankfully, trade and investment between Wisconsin and the United Kingdom continues to grow, and we hope will expand even more after this trip. Most of all, our 2 countries have a special relationship because of our shared values. Together, we triumphed over the forces of evil, not once, but twice, during 2 different world wars. And it is why we will conquer the new forces of evil that have affected the world even as we speak today. The graves at Brookwood serve as a permanent reminder of the special relationship between the people of the United States of America and of the people of the United Kingdom. Let the sacrifices of these service members not be in vain. Let us ensure that our special bond is not broken. Together, let us move our countries forward. Thank you. May God bless you, and may God continue to bless freedom-loving people all across the world.
Have a seat, Governor. Thank you very much. Let's go straight to questions. There was someone right at the front there. Do we have microphones that are going to come round? Because if we do, if you could just pause and maybe just say you are, and then... So we'll start over there. Lots of people want them. Yeah, we'll get to everyone. We'll go across. We'll go right to left, which is only, well, my right to left, or the governor's right to left, although possibly there's no one on the governor's right. Well, maybe there is, yeah. So, gentleman here, yeah. Or, well, go for both of you, yeah.
Darren McCaffrey from Sky News. I think I spotted you today at Prime Minister Question Time in the gallery. I just thought, what do you think of that spectacle of PMQs? And second of all, lots being talked about in this country about Britain's economic future and whether it's best placed that we remain within the European Union. In your opinion, is it best that Britain remains within the European Union?
Well, 2 different parts. I'll take the easy one first. Yes, it was an interesting, I guess as your words say it, spectacle, although I've seen it on TV before. The Prime Minister was kidding with me last night that he ran into someone who said, I really like your TV show. But I guess for those of us, particularly in America, who like to watch it, it's an interesting contrast. While we have spirited debates, usually they're in the media or literally at a debate as opposed to being in the Parliament. But I found it amazing. In fact, as remarkable as you might think this is, watching there sitting in the gallery, I found myself listening to questions thinking, what would I say? How would my response be? And and both a combination of logic and empathy, because I think that's important. At least we find in our state and in our country that you want to directly answer the question, but you also need to begin with the empathy for not necessarily the question asker, in this case, a fellow elected official, but also where does it come from? What's the context of where does it come from? So I find it interesting. I mean, I think there's strengths with each system. Obviously, a fair amount of what we have in America is borrowed from the British here, and so we certainly value that as well as that relationship.
Can you think of senior American politicians who would prosper in that atmosphere?
Not many. Although there were times when I would have liked to have been able to ask questions today, like we're asking the Prime Minister of some others out there. No, I mean, it's the closest thing we get is in high-stakes debates. I've gone through 3 elections for governor in 4 years, so I've gone through a lot of debates. And they vary in form. Some are very traditional. You stand at a podium, you get X number of minutes and seconds. And then I've had others where you have a moderator, like we're discussing now, where that's kind of a free-for-all. But it's interesting. The closest thing I think I would have had in America was not as governor, although I had about 4 years ago, about this time, about 100,000 protesters in and around my capital. So that was a little unnerving. But it was when I was the county executive in Milwaukee County before being governor. I was the first and probably only Republican ever elected in Milwaukee County. I was elected there 3 times after a scandal. And when I used to give budget addresses in front of the county board, much smaller chamber, certainly than here and even in Wisconsin, but we'd be in there, and in the back row, one of the public employee unions literally would have signs, and they made up a variety of signs that they would alter depending on what point I was in the speech and what point I was going to make, because they didn't know about it in advance. So whatever I said, they would try and put up one of the signs literally in the chambers while I was talking. So I didn't see any of that today. I did see members standing up and yelling or calling out, but they didn't have any signs out there. So that's, for me, at least the closest I've got. In terms of the economy, as you can imagine, and I'm not trying to skirt your question, I just think, for me, commenting on foreign policy, or in this case, economic policy in a country where you're a visitor, it's not the politest of things. Obviously, we want a strong UK because we've got a special partnership. We want a strong Europe because overall we've got a lot of tremendous allies there. And we think, as I mentioned in my context or my comments, we think overall a global economy that's strong is important, not just around the world. It's important before we have to pay the bills for electricity. It's important for each of our respective countries.
John there.
Oh, thank you. Name's Mike Harvey. Governor Walker, country of origin labelling has been a dispute in the WTO for quite some time, and obviously cattle have some effect there, and of course with you promoting the cheese of Wisconsin, you've got an interest there. The World Trade Organization has voted several times, or decided several times, against the United States. The interesting thing is the action has been led by NAFTA partners, global partnerships for strong local economies, open for free trade. Canada believes it costs in sales to the United States almost $1 billion, this protectionist measure. The World Trade Organization decided against the United States just a few months ago. The Wisconsin National Farmers Union president stands very behind this protectionist measure. Where do you stand?
Well, as you heard in my comments, I believe in free trade. I think we can compete with anybody in the world, and I think our allies can as well, as long as you have free trade means fair trade, that it means that it's wide open. And the example I gave of Colby cheese is a good example. I don't begrudge someone in any other part of the world from trying to make Colby cheese that's better than what we make in the state of Wisconsin, in the same way that cheesemakers in Wisconsin can make Parmesan cheese or any others out there, I think, as well as someone who may have that location or that connection related to them. And so one of the things we brought up in our comments to the ambassador and to others is that we're very open to free trade, but we think it should be fair and open and truly a spot where anyone can compete.
Does that go as far as, I mean, the other big sticking point, actually on both sides of the Atlantic when it comes to TTIP, this question of rules and regulations that people almost culturally believe are safe. And one of the things, living in America for a bit, quite apart from Cheese Whiz, I'm thinking of the finer cheese products that come from Wisconsin. One of the things is that they tend to be pasteurized, they tend to be quite, there's a safety issue there, and a lot of the French cheeses are going to come. Are you seriously saying that there isn't going to be a resistance on the American side, as this gentleman was suggesting, actually? When it comes to it, there is a resistance, so it will be almost a cultural one.
No, that'll be a part of it. When we've talked to, again, our federal officials who are involved in the negotiations, I only bring it up as a governor who's obviously got a vested interest in terms of cheese production. We create about 25% of all the cheese in America just in one state alone, and almost half of the specialty cheese. So that's an area where we're very interested in free trade, in the sense that we think we can compete, as I mentioned in the awards. We consistently have some of the best cheese in the world.
And you think you'll let them all in? That's the point as well. Quite apart from your cheeses going out, you think anything?
Well, we think those are, in the larger context, obviously that's part of the give and take of negotiations, not just on this issue, but others, is respecting each of the trading partners and the concerns that they have. But to me, ultimately, the freer, the more level the playing field, the better. Okay. And then you let consumers ultimately. Any
more cheese questions? No, I'm only kidding. Yeah, go.
It's a cheesy question, maybe not a cheese question.
Here we go. And then we'll
not a cheese question. My name's Carl Adam. I'm with the Washington Post. Do you think that Britain could be doing more in its fight against ISIS? A group of lawmakers here recently said that the British contribution was strikingly modest. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when I return to the States, I'll probably give you an answer. But to me, I just think common practice is when someone visits in a position like I'm in from the United States, it's just, I don't think it's polite to respond on policy regarding the United States interaction with other countries when you're in a foreign country. I mean, to me, I defer to the president, even though I don't always believe in the same things that he does politically. But that's certainly something I'll answer in the future when I'm in the United States regarding ISIS and other issues. But I think right here, for me on a trade mission, we're talking about that. You've seen it with others in the past who've been here. And there's a few of late who commented on it that I just think goes against common practice.
Really, that's an interesting, I mean, it's just an interesting thing, really, because it's almost a kind of old-fashioned way of looking at the way that politicians, senior American politicians, should behave when abroad. You seriously, is that because of you're here on an official visit, or is it because you think actually it's the wrong thing to do for anyone?
Both. I mean, it's in part, clearly, because I'm here on a trade mission, trade and investment, sent here by the people of the state of Wisconsin through our Economic Development Corporation. But it's also, even if I wasn't, if I was here or here in the future, if I was an announced candidate at that point and was here in that regard, I think particularly when it comes to foreign policy, I just think, you say, maybe it is a bit old-fashioned, but I think there was some sense in the past to saying that when you're in any country, not just the United Kingdom, that you're anywhere else around the world, no matter what my opinions might be of this president of the United States right now, I just don't think it's wise to undermine the president of your own country.
What about a question, though, on that doesn't involve the president and involves the broader fight against ISIS and how you think it's going and whether you think it should be invigorated?
Again, without getting too far into detail, I would just say I'd reference a point that I made in my State of the State address back in January, where I said I commented on it. Then some people read into it. It had larger implications. It was just simple as my belief, speaking as governor on behalf of the people of my state, and that was I made reference to France at the time with what happened in Paris, and said that I believe the one thing, I made two references. At the beginning of my speech, I referenced our military and recognized some of them. And so at the end of the speech, I said the one thing in my state that could bring both Republicans and Democrats, or should bring both Republicans and Democrats together, was in part support for our men and women who were deployed at that time and their families and those who were preparing to deploy. And secondly, that as people from Wisconsin, as Americans, anytime freedom-loving people were under attack anywhere in the world, that we should stand out and speak out against those who would bring that out. And I pointed out the people that I thought were responsible for that, and that probably got the loudest sustained applause from both parties, because I think there's a sense in Wisconsin and in America that we need to be united in that regard.
But do you have a sense, as a governor from a state, and it's both an enormous plus in that you have to take decisions, you have to actually do things, and you're answerable for them, but it's also in a sense a minus because you are quite removed from the outside world and from what's going on. You obviously don't want to go into detail here, but do you have a sense of a Scott Walker foreign policy emerging? I mean, do you have a sense of the outside world and how you want to address it?
Again, I think I'd violate the conditions I laid out if I laid out a foreign policy here.
Yeah.
I don't
no,
think
I'm not.
But I'll just
feel
say.
Free,
but I'll say, and you're a good interviewer to ask, and to repeatedly ask, which is a good interviewer, and I'll repeatedly give you the same answer. But I will say, just as a governor, one thing people don't No, at least in Wisconsin, I would assume it's true with most other governors, is while we don't give a lot of speeches on foreign policy, in addition to obvious things like trade missions and trade trips and things of that nature, we get risk assessments. I get briefed by not only my adjutant general, which is the head of the Wisconsin National Guard, we get briefed by the FBI and threat assessments, not only in our state, but within our region and sometimes all across our country. And I guess I'd tell you as a governor, without violating the confidentiality of specific items there, it concerns me both as a governor and as a parent that I think there are very real threats in this world, not only around the world, but in our own country. And so we take those very seriously. And when I see men and women who are deployed from my Wisconsin National Guard, obviously I understand the reasons, and I'm going to support them regardless of the mission. But it does concern me. And I'm not a big bracelet guy, but I've got 3 bracelets on my arm, which are from 3 service members' families who, since I've been governor, asked me to wear them at their funerals for their sons. And so I also understand the gravity of what happens when you make those decisions.
Yeah, and we'll keep going in this direction, but maybe, is that the simplest thing to do? We could just pass the microphone from person to person.
Thank you, Justin. Governor, my name is James Boyes. I'm author of a new book called Clinton's Grand Strategy, which I mention because yourself, such as Governor Clinton before you and Governor Bush before you, come from a domestic policy background, but if you decide to put your hat in the ring in 2016, you'll obviously need to address foreign policy. I just wonder if you could perhaps discuss who might be advising you or who you go to for advice on foreign policy, and leading into Justin's question there about a nascent foreign policy, not going into details about the policy, but who you might be discussing that policy with within the American intellectual academic community.
Yep. Well, I'll tell you a quick story and then tell you what my response is to the question. Earlier this year, I was at the Armed Forces dinner in Milwaukee, one of our big cities in the state of Wisconsin. And the guest speaker was someone I'm a great admirer of, James Lovell, who, of course, was an astronaut in our national program years and years ago. Of course, Apollo 13, if you've ever seen the movie, is in part based on him and his life. He's got a connection in Wisconsin. Actually, one of his sons during Apollo 13's launch was actually at a school there. And he got up during Armed Forces Week, and I admired him even when I was younger because he's an Eagle Scout, and I aspired to and ended up being an Eagle Scout. And he got up and he gave this speech all about the armed forces and the military and our thanks for them, and this wonderful speech. And after he got done, the moderator, or the MC for the event, came up there, clapped, leaned in, and you could tell he was whispering something in his ear. And suddenly, James Lovell came back to the podium, and he said, well, it seems that the Master of Ceremonies has told me that while that was a great speech, everybody came to hear about Apollo 13. The reason I tell you that story is I get that everybody's coming here to hear those sorts of questions, but in deference to the fact that it's not just being glib, because I am here officially on a trade and investment tour, for me to lay out foreign policy or start answering, I think would go contrary to the reason I'm here. So in the future, I'd be more than happy to talk about that, and will probably be when I get back on the other side of the pond.
Okay, handing back one, if you would. Yeah, there you go. And then we'll go across.
Yeah, hello, Governor. Douglas Newman, member of Chatham House. And I have a domestic policy issue to ask you for a change.
Sure.
I mean, in discussing and promoting investment in Wisconsin, you rightfully highlighted the importance of a dynamic workforce and in universities. And I've been involved also in investment promotion in the U.S. and have found those to be factors of great interest to potential foreign investors. I just noticed that in your latest budget proposal, you've proposed cutting $300 million from the University of Wisconsin system, which is really one of the great public university systems in the U.S. I'm just wondering, I mean, isn't this, when universities are very important for not just in research and education, but in private sector partnerships and in creating a strong workforce. I mean, aren't you eating your seed corn?
No, and I'll tell you why. Well, that's a great question for a couple reasons. Certainly, I have a vested interest not only as governor, I'm a father of a UW student. So one of my sons goes to the University of Wisconsin at the flagship in Madison. So as a parent, my wife and I obviously want a great UW in the future. Just as governor, I want that. On this trade mission this morning, we started out with an alumni breakfast with alumni from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin, Madison, and Marquette University, one of our private schools in the state. And we actually have, as part of our Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation team, one of our jointly funded vice president positions is actually done with the University of Wisconsin for precisely those reasons. So you might say, well, okay, that's great, but that doesn't answer the question. When our nearly $70 billion budget, we made, which is a 2-year budget, we made $150 million, because it goes to the base, $50 million change in the University of Wisconsin system, which to put in perspective is about a 2.5% change in their total budget per year. 2.5%. What they get in return is that after years of administrators, chancellors, supporters, alumni, others saying to me even before I was governor that they could save millions of dollars by getting out from underneath the thumb of the bureaucracy of state government so that they could do procurement, purchasing, construction, compensation, all sorts of other things that they could do at a much more cost-effective basis with savings they could put back into the UW system. We have done just that. We propose in this budget as well an authority, still with a block grant on an annual basis that's funded from the state government to the university system, which is just a fraction. The fraction of the money they get is from the state as a whole. It comes from tuition, grants, services, contributions, all sorts of other things out there. But we set that aside, a block grant that forevermore will be adjusted by inflation. So they'll permanently know going ahead into the future, if this budget passes as I proposed, what their amount will be giving, so they have stable funding far into the future. And the dollar amount, which is 2.5% of the total operating budget of the university system, we think more than is accounted for in terms of the savings that we put up on the system. Now, you say, okay, wait a minute, how can that be? Well, it's very much like what we did 4 years ago. You mentioned a little bit in the introduction, where we made similar changes for schools and local government as well as state government, so the changes we made to collective bargaining. People said it would be the death of public education in my state. Back then, I had 2 kids in public high schools, and I said I have a vested interest then, just like I do now in the UW system. And I said I want a system that works the same or better. And so because of our reforms, today, public schools in our state actually have better test scores. Graduation rates are up since I've been governor. 3rd grade reading scores are up. ACT scores are now 2nd best in the country in Wisconsin. Why? Because we allowed the tools that were needed to take on that system and put the power, in the case of local governments, back in the school board members and local government officials. They in turn use that not just to get pension and health care contributions, which were still very reasonable compared to non-government entities, but they were also able to change things like seniority or overtime abuse or other things and put that money right back into the classroom. I believe with our authority, the same thing will happen with the University of Wisconsin system.
Well, how did you get in this mess, though, about changing its stated purpose? I don't want to get into too much detail because it bore people who don't know a lot about the University of Wisconsin, and I certainly don't, but you fiddled with something that a lot of people felt very strongly about. Do you regret doing that?
Well, we didn't do it intentionally, and there's a lot of dispute about that. Okay. But I mean, for us, when we looked at an authority, I had 2 separate discussions with the regent leadership and the president of the University of Wisconsin system. Never once discussed that. In fact, in all of our discussions, the only thing we talked about was adding something regarding career and workforce development to the mission of the university system once it became an authority. In the discussions back and forth, and there were multiple meetings with our staff and our budget team and others out there, one of the instructions from my office was to keep it simple. They took that as meaning keep it simple and just add career and workforce development language. We meant keep it simple, don't add anything more, add that to what's there. And so the day after it was introduced or proposed, when it was pointed out that was in there, we said it's not a big deal. That was not our intention. We would take it out. The thing they got worked up about is I tweeted that I said it was a drafting error. It wasn't technically a drafting error. The drafters had the language. It was an error in terms of the communication from the policy office to the drafting attorneys. But in an era where people are asking a lot of questions about an office more than just governor, a mole becomes an ant becomes a molehill.
Did you learn something from that, do you think? I'm thinking about your wider ambitions and the longer term. I mean, was that a kind of what Americans sometimes call a teachable moment? We don't yet do that here. I think actually John Humphreys wouldn't allow it, but there we are.
Again, that's just one where the media, the same media that's called me as a prospective candidate a few weeks ago bland, and I thought it would be a negative. I said I'd rather be bland than stupid or ignorant or moronic or other things out there that are some of the definitions.
You got all of that to come. Yeah, gentlemen there, yeah. If we could just keep going across and then we'll go back a bit as well.
Greek elections recently, we've had the rise of Syriza, and there's also a kind of accompanying anti-austerity movement, which I guess you've seen some up close and personal in Wisconsin. Are you kind of afraid that there's a growing threat? Because now that's a successful democratic movement that actually was elected, that kind of changes the calculus as opposed to just people holding up banners in threat against you. And just a bit more specifically, on this Wisconsin University thing, this supposed drafting error or whatever the way, it does also show the way you can damage something that's much loved by an institution. So the NHS over here is really loved, and it costs a fortune, but all of the political parties have promised ahead of the next election that they will safeguard and ring-fence the funding for it. How do you see that role as a governor or as a president or whatever in protecting and safeguarding something, an institution that is cherished by the people?
Yeah, in reverse order, certainly on the Wisconsin idea, that's something that's important, again, not only as a governor, but as the father of a student who believes that very passionately as a sophomore at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, our capital city. And that's why the moment, it wasn't a big to-do for me once it was pointed out. I said, of course we're not. We don't even have to amend our budget. We actually have something, a weird name called errata legislation that's the actual official document. You present the framework of it at the budget address, and then you have the technical document that comes back and cleans up any drafting errors or adjustments or things like that. That'll be a part of that. And so for us, we said, we'll just do it there. It's not a policy decision. It's not a backtracking. We just clearly defined it and said, yeah, we made an error in doing it and explained why and moved on. On the other part, on Greece, and I'll relate it to Wisconsin, as you might guess, but 4 years ago when I first came in, I inherited a $3.6 billion budget deficit. The rainy day fund was almost gone. There were all sorts of other challenges. Our bond rating was down. The previous governor had rated about $1 billion+ out of the transportation fund, and that took money from the patient compensation fund that was used to compensate families for medical malpractice and things of that nature. It was a wreck. And I would contend that some people and some other governors around the country, in my country at the time, had similar, although very few had as big of a deficit as we faced, but had similar challenges. And some chose austerity, and some chose anti-austerity. They chose raising taxes and fees and things like that. What we did was neither. We chose reform. And the reason I'd say that is if I was just about austerity in my state, even with those dire circumstances, I would have cut things across the board. But what we did is, and as a local official for 8 years, I knew one of the biggest parts of my state budget by far is aid to local governments, to schools, to counties, to municipalities. As a local official, I knew if you just cut a major portion of that without anything in response, you would devastate our schools and our local governments. And as a local official prior to being governor, and as someone who appreciated local government but also had 2 kids in a public school at the time, I didn't want to do that. And so even though it got much bigger response, mainly because I would argue the big government unions in Washington didn't like the fact that not only we did what we did, but on top of that, I gave public employees in my state, all 300,000 plus, the freedom to choose whether they wanted to be in a union and pay those dues or not. That's why it went from thousands to 100,000, because they didn't like that threat. I was taking the power of the hands of the big government unions and putting it in the hands of the people, the hardworking taxpayers of my state. And now they actually get to make the decisions. They make the decision at the school board, at the town board, at the city council, the county board, and state government. And so we put in place reforms that allowed us to reduce the amount of budget that was spent on local governments, but in return, it's been documented by several sources, more than $3 billion worth of savings because of those reforms. I'll give you a good example. Before I was elected governor, almost all my school districts, 424 school districts in my state, almost all of them had to buy their health insurance from just one firm. It just happened to be associated with the teachers union. And so what they would do is they'd tie that into their contract with the local school district. Once we got rid of the changes we made through what's called Act 10, in turn our school districts can go out and bid it out. Well, they saved millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars, money they could put right back into the classroom. In fact, I remember one modestly sized school district saved $3.1 million just in the first year alone. They bid it out, and the company that they originally had, the WA Trust, eventually got the bid, but for $3.1 million less than what they had before when they were forced to do it that way. What we found is it had a tremendously positive impact, but instead of just cutting, what you would reference austerity and others talk about around Europe, we really looked at reforms. We looked at it as an opportunity to say, I don't like the false choices that government were often given. Nobody outside of government makes those choices. You don't say when times are tough, I'm either going to double the price of my product or I'm going to cut the quality in half, or you go out of business, right? But yet in government, you're always either told taxes either have to go up or the quality of services have to go down dramatically. When in reality, everyone outside of government, or at least in my country, almost everyone outside of government that's successful finds a way to balance quality and cost, and that's what we did in the Wisconsin way.
Yeah, let's go right to the back now, shall we? And then we'll come forward again and go left.
Thank you. Martin Benedict from the Associated Press. Governor, can I ask you whether you think that the United States should arm the Ukrainian rebels?
I should get my iPod out and just hit the same answer each time, right? I mean, again, it's one of those, I have an opinion on that, and I'll be certainly happy to answer that back when I'm stateside, but per being old-fashioned and having respect for the president, I just don't think you talk about foreign policy when you're on foreign soil.
And to the front, and then we'll go right to the back again and keep going across, yeah? So we'll go down next over there, yeah?
And I hope in terms of the AP's quote, that's not a no comment. I gave an answer, right?
Hello, Governor Walker. My name is Matthew Conway. I'm from Brookfield, Wisconsin. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison just under 2 years ago. Chancellor Rebecca Blank, the leader of our university, said that the cuts to the University of Wisconsin budget will cause tuition increases after the tuition freeze. Expires in 4 years, correct?
Mm-hmm. 2 years. 2 years. It's 2 years before, 2 years continuing.
Right. After that, the tuition will increase, making it less affordable to students such as myself, and especially minorities in Wisconsin. Wisconsin made headlines a bit ago on the national stage for being ranked the worst state in the country to be black in. Can you comment on that and explain what you've been doing in Wisconsin to change this notoriety and to, this is all in regards to like incarceration rates, poverty rates, things such as this. If you could comment on that.
Sure. There are two different parts. I'll comment first off on the tuition. As you probably know from the point you referenced, the last 2 years I was the first governor ever to freeze tuition 2 years in a row. This next budget, which only lasts 2 years, will freeze it for the next two. My hope with an authority would be, and I think there's some lawmakers in the state legislature that want to put it in the statutes, I'd be open to that, to permanently putting in place some sort of a cap on tuition. As you may or may not know, did you go to Brookfield East or Central? Oh, very nice. My sons played for Wauwatosa East, so they're an arch rival, although your football team consistently beat us at the tail end. But in terms of tuition, as some people may or may not know, in my predecessor's first term, he cut the university system $250 million, and because he didn't give them any terms of support and authority or any other tools out there, tuition went up by about double digits, as I remember it, the first 2 years. So if you don't have a connection to that, those sorts of adjustments to the budget will drive up tuition. We capped it off for the next 2 years precisely so it wouldn't add to the burden of working families and college students in our state. And like I said, I'd be more than happy to make sure that tuition is capped, maybe off inflation or something like that, going forward and working with the legislature, because I want to make it affordable. And I think realistically, for a UW system that's looking at a 2.5% reduction, I think all of us could make 2.5% reductions in our own households and in our company budgets and do that in a way, particularly when we're given all sorts of new tools to deal with in a way that's very reasonable, just like our schools and our local governments have done in the past. In terms of the racial issue, depending on where you're at, consistently for the last several decades, that's been a challenge largely because of some of the policies in the city of Milwaukee. We've tried to act beyond just the city of Milwaukee or beyond their leadership and do things like Transform Milwaukee, where in the last 2 years we've invested more than $200 million through our Wisconsin Housing Economic Development Authority to try and drive up investment, to drive up employment, because in the end, revitalizing particularly key neighborhoods within the city of Milwaukee, which is our largest city, is going to have the greatest impact, not only economically, but in terms of all the other issues you alluded to.
Yeah, right at the back, and then we'll go back across.
Thank you, Governor. My name is Rory Cannan, and I work on the United States Research Program here in Chatham House. And you'll be pleased to know my question is not on foreign policy or cheese, so something different. You might have noticed here in the UK and Europe in general, there's somewhat of a political fracture going on right now. In the United States, we seem to see a different problem, which is political polarization, which has been sort of an ongoing trend for a while. When I talk to some Americans, they reassure me that eventually there'll be some kind of a course correction and things will change, and you won't look at government shutdowns as something that happens quite often. So my question is A, does this worry you that there doesn't seem to be a change in that trend at the moment? And kind of B, what do you think American leaders should and can do to try and address the problems that this trend kind of leads to in American political life?
Well, from my experience at both the state and the national level, with talking with other governors, my advice to Washington would be similar on this particular issue, would be similar to what I say to other governors in the country, and that is twofold. One, don't take the bait. And so I think one part of the issue at both the state and the national level is the media, the same outlets that editorialize that they want bipartisanship and working together, tend to only cover the people who say the most outrageous things in the media. And so largely I think they're to blame. Not solely to blame, but they're a big part of that because they really highlight those people who are the most at odds without putting attention on the people who are actually trying to get things done. I've said this is not new, I've said this to the AP has a program each year for all the newspapers in my state, and I've said it in front of all the editors. I said, you all editorialize on one page that you want people working together, and then on the front page, the only people you cover are the people fighting. And I used a good example where we had two bills that were very significant about that time. One was highly controversial because it had partisan differences. The other was probably more significant, but passed with all but 4 members of the legislature voting for it. I said they didn't even cover, or the ones that did put it buried, next to the obituaries in a paragraph, the one that I thought was more significant in terms of policy. Because it wasn't sexy, it wasn't entertaining, it didn't get the big headlines out there, and yet in terms of impact, it had more. So I think elected officials for sure have responsibility, but I think the media, at least in my country and in my state, has partial responsibility because the things they highlight are the things that go at odds with each other.
How does that reflect on Fox News then?
Well, I think it's all, I think you go across the board, you look at every network. I think there's every network, I think you look at almost every newspaper. It's why I mentioned it even to my home state local weekly newspapers. Some less so than others, but I think it's an impact across the board.
But on politics, it's a sort of serious point. On politics, one of the things that he was getting at, this sort of polarization business, it is driven, isn't it? To the extent that it's driven at all by the media, and you can argue about that, but those cable shows and the way in which politics is covered in America and the way in which it's soaks into people from the net and the way in which trust, you think of what's happened recently to a very prominent newsreader, and the kind of way in which the American news picture is now is part of the problem, isn't it? And Fox.
Well, I said it is part of the channel across the board. It's not just those outlets out there. It's not just cable news, no matter which station or network you're looking at. Even look at my colleague, my friend. Literally, he is my friend who came here a week or so ago. And I'm not going to get into his statement, but just saying that became the focus. It certainly was here. It was the United States, even though that probably wasn't the most substantive thing he was talking about here. And yet, for whatever reason, that was the lead in many ways on the news out there.
You're talking about Chris Christie and vaccination.
Yeah. And so I just think that's a good example where there's this almost magnetic thing where they go to whatever is the most glaring headline out there, even though that might not be the substance. Now, the other part of your question, though, is it kind of fits in with that, and that is even though I got all the attention you alluded to before, and there are obviously some people on the left side of the political spectrum who don't much care for me or my policies, most people don't know that if you actually look at all the bills I signed into law, more than 97% of the bills I've signed, the pieces of legislation I've signed into law as governor, have had more than just Republican votes. Now I even get PolitiFact checking me on that because that sounds so absurd. When you look at the headlines, nobody, people that think that can't be true. But yet more than 97% of the laws that have been signed since I've been governor had more than just Republicans in the state legislature voting for. Well, that's not interesting because that's actually getting things done. It's getting things done without just doing it by force with your party. Now, there are some high-profile things that were Republican only, but not many when you look at that percentage out there. And I think that, to your point about where states, and I would say governors, regardless of party, are a prime example where governors are more apt to get things done, in part because in most cases, per our Constitution, for example, we have to have the state level, we have to have balanced budgets. That makes for a big difference. But in the end, the closer you are to the people, the more apt it is. I mean, you think about, we think of Adam Smith as you do with economic policy, but we also think some of the founders of our country had a pretty good idea, for example, in the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights, that basically said anything that's not clearly defined in the Constitution is inherently the rights of the states and, more importantly, the people. I think over many, many years, the federal government, regardless of party, has gradually taken more and more and more power away from the states and the people. And I think that's part of the problem, regardless of politics, or partisan politics, I should say.
Let's go over this side a bit. Yeah, someone right at the back, and then we'll come over to... Here we go.
Michael Dakin. Governor Walker, I want to get back onto economics, and congratulations.
I'm glad you didn't say foreign policy.
Yes, I'm going to avoid that entirely. It may involve a bit of cheese, however. So, congratulations on the performance of the Wisconsin economy, which I think has been spectacular, not just in light of current economic circumstances and the turnaround, but actually if you look at it in the longer span over 20 or 30 years, the narrative was, the death of the industrial heartland of the United States, the death of American agriculture, both areas which Wisconsin has performed very well in. I think it's very interesting from the context sitting here in London, where you've got a huge industrial heartland in the UK, which continues to struggle to revitalize itself in great industrial cities that face significant challenges. And that may well be part of the conversations that you're having. I wouldn't ask you to comment on that. But from a Wisconsin perspective, you talked about reform politically and within state and local organizations. But what, in terms of free market initiatives, do you think have helped that economic rebound? And other areas of the United States haven't performed so well, including some of your neighbors in the Midwest. And do you have any suggestions on how your success could be exported?
Sure. Well, a couple different things. One, overall, my general view is that there's two ways that the government can play a role in terms of the economy, at least in my state, but I think arguably it could be elsewhere in the United States and maybe elsewhere around the world. One is, in many ways, just getting out of the way. It's why the tax burden has gone down by about $2 billion, not only in property taxes, income taxes, employer taxes. For those of you, if anyone's here interested in manufacturing or agriculture in our state, by next year, by 2016, we wipe out almost all of the taxable liability. When I came in, it was 7.9%. It's 0.4% will be the last remaining components there. Why? Because we know, particularly for small and mid-sized manufacturers as well as agriculture interests, most of those employers are going to take whatever money that we don't take from them, and they're going to reinvest that in equipment and technologies and innovations that will ultimately help create more jobs. So we put more power back into people's hands in that regard. We also looked at other costs in our state. For years, it was a highly costly regulatory environment. We've streamlined that. We put a moratorium on, and then we've capped off and reduced many of our regulations. Simply put, I like to say what we enforce now is common sense, not bureaucratic red tape. And then we put in place significant tort reforms or lawsuit reforms, because we saw with employers, particularly small businesses and family farmers, that didn't have the big, massive legal staffs, that was a huge deterrent to grow and ate up too much of their time. So one area, it's about lowering cost. The other area, and it kind of ties into the initial part of your comment, is where appropriate, we think being a good partner when it comes to things like the workforce and infrastructure is also important. And so on infrastructure, after my predecessor took $1 billion out of the transportation fund, we've restored that. We've revitalized our roads and our bridges, our ports, our airports, our freight rail. We've put in place more efforts to do cost-effective, reliable sources of power. We've even put in our rural parts more broadband access. In metropolitan areas, it's not a big deal, but in rural and forest-driven areas of the state, it's a huge problem. Those are very attractive areas in terms of their natural resources, but without broadband, high-speed internet access, very difficult to do global business in.
How are you paying for the infrastructure stuff? Because it's such a big issue in the States, isn't it? And you see states with kind of lottery funding and stuff to try to raise the money. And when you travel the world, there are parts of the world that look more modern than America now, which is odd, isn't it? Are you, seriously, hand on heart, are you doing what you need to do in Wisconsin with the kind of money that you're not raising from taxes?
We do, and we have a separate, in fact, we just passed a constitutional amendment so that something like what my predecessor did can't happen again, where they raid money. In our state, it's largely the gas tax or the vehicle registration fee. And in the past, sometimes, well, many, many years ago, it was kind of a bipartisan consensus that infrastructure wasn't a partisan issue. It was just something you needed to do. My predecessor, for whatever reasons, I'll let him answer those, took money out of that fund. We've tried to pay that back, but we now have a constitutional amendment that requires, our Constitution now, I should say, now requires that those funds collected for transportation purposes have to be solely used within the transportation fund, which helps us, and it helps us in terms of any long-term bonding we do because it ups our bond rating as well, because the gas tax is then committed for those purposes. So we do that. But the other big part, I would just add to that, is on a little point to some of the questions about the university, but I would also add our technical college system, which some would call community colleges in other places around our country, and you might call here, but it's really our two-year associate degrees. We've increasingly found for employers, not just in manufacturing, but in information technology, in healthcare, transportation, and construction, other fields, there is a huge gap between those who go on to a four-year or a graduate level degree program and folks just coming out of high school. Historically in our country, particularly in my state, which is very heavily dependent on manufacturing, it used to be, you joke, if you had a good alarm clock and a strong back, you could get a job. Manufacturing jobs are no longer in that vein. You talked about the long term. The benefit for us is manufacturing has gone up dramatically. Agriculture continues to grow, but the number of jobs haven't kept pace. Why? Because there's more automation, there's more innovation. The difference now, though, is the quality of those jobs and the quality of pay for careers in those jobs have gone up. The challenge is, and I'm not a big spender, as you can guess, but I put this last summer alone $28 million more into my technical colleges to buy down the wait list for things like highly skilled welders, machinists, fabricators, IT technicians, certified nursing assistants. Why? Because I know it's not only about career and workforce development. If I can show that we can fill those positions on a rapid basis, I'll actually attract more business. And I actually heard it just yesterday. We had an event at FDI magazine that they set up with facilitating employers and investors. That was the most common thing we've heard. It's the most common thing we've heard from site selectors here looking to invest in the United States, from companies, investors, is it used to be just taxes and regulatory climate, things like that. Increasingly, it's about workforce. Some of it's compensation, but overwhelmingly, it's about access to qualified workers.
Final one from over here. I did promise I'd get in. Let's take a couple. Just yes, the lady there, and then to the back.
Hi, Stacey Hilliard. I'm a director of an international development consultancy here in London, and a lot of the places that we're working with the governments implementing private sector policies and helping them develop it. And we often hear that trade is aid in this field. And I wonder what you would say as far as any caveats that need to be put on free trade, and especially those partners of ours who are consistent violators of human rights.
Right. Hold that thought, if you were, Governor. And then, gentlemen, right at the back, let's take yours as well. Yeah.
I work for a private oil company, Koch Industries, in Houston, Texas, and I know Wisconsin's not a big oil-producing state, but what is your opinion on lifting the crude oil export ban out of the United States?
Okay.
Sure, a couple different points on it. One, on the first part of the trade, at least for our state, what we deal with trade is the incentives and the promotions and the work that we do in terms of caps or things of that nature. I and the other states ultimately defer to our federal government on that. That's one where they do have an appropriate role. As much as they should be limited in other areas, they have an appropriate role. And obviously, I think any of us have concerns about human rights. So without going too far down that track, defining things on behalf of the federal government, but that's where we would defer to things. In terms of well, again, we want free trade. We want free markets. We want free markets as much as possible. But that's something the federal government's going to have to address overall in terms of not just in oil, but in all the different energy supplies. In our state, we try to approach an all of the above. Even though we don't have the supplies or the site generation that you talk about in other parts of the country, we do have a vested interest. We're in manufacturing. We're one of the top states for manufacturing in the country. So not only with oil and natural gas, certainly clean burning coal is an important element for us. We made significant changes in terms of requirements over the past decade for our factories and other employers in terms of making sure that we're ahead of the curve in terms of emissions and things of that nature. And we have a significant base of wind, nuclear, solar, but we do have a surprising interest in other supplies as well. Thanks to God and the glaciers, people would be surprised to know this, we have the best industrial sand in the United States and arguably in the world. So we have an interest in what happens in terms of the use of industrial sand in terms of supplies out there. And with the pipeline between Canada that would go into the United States. We've had a vested interest in that for some time because a number of our key employers are engaged in the building of pipelines like that, and we're very much interested in that.
We're out of time. Governor, I know you've got to be somewhere else. Can I finish with a question that it's almost a tradition now to ask visiting, particularly senior Republicans who come to London. And it's not about cheese, and it's not about foreign affairs. It's actually about evolution. Are you comfortable with the idea of evolution? Do you believe in it? Do you accept it?
For me, I'm gonna punt on that one as well.
No,
that does you
really.
That's a question a politician shouldn't be involved in one way or the other on. So I'm going to leave that up to you.
But any British politician, right or left wing, would laugh and say, yes, of course, evolution's true. But
to me, I said it's just one of those where I'm here to talk about trade, not to pontificate on other issues. I love the evolution of trade in Wisconsin. Yeah. It's going well, and I'd like to see an even bigger evolution as well.
Thank you very much, Governor. Lovely to talk to you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.